Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1, and we are going to be talking about the definition of feminism in this lecture. So, what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to define the concept of feminism. Next, we're going to talk about the diversity within feminism and the different definitions. And then we will be looking at the historical waves of feminism. So that's what we're going to look at in the lecture. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the first thing I want you to keep in mind as we are learning about the definition of feminism is that feminism is an ideology. In other words, it's a political worldview. And you know that because of that it has the ISM at the end of the word. And so there might be other ideologies that you are familiar with, such as liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, socialism. Those are all examples of ideologies, and feminism is an ideology as well. And so that when we say that feminism is an ideology, I think it helps to define what we mean by ideology. And this comes from an American government textbook, the definition in We the People of ideology. And in that textbook, it says that an ideology is a more or less consistent set of beliefs about the nature of the society in which individuals live and about the proper role of the state in establishing or maintaining that society. And so when you think about conservatism, one of the consistent set of beliefs that conservatives have is that tradition really matters, that they have assumptions that people are sort of born a certain way and that it's hard to kind of get out of that. It's hard to change people. And so you can see that kind of gets reflected in maybe the kinds of policies or elected officials conservatives might support. They might want to support elected officials that really value tradition and make sure that our government is aligned by the sort of the traditional principles of the Constitution. Liberals are different. They see humans as being more malleable, that they are not set at birth, that they're don't see tradition as maybe a negative thing, not holy, but they see progress as a good thing, right? And so feminism is along those same lines, not in terms of conservative or liberal, but it has a set of beliefs, okay? So as we look at these definitions, keep this idea that this has a consistent set of beliefs and that it's reflected in the role that the state should play. Feminism is also a social movement. And so when you have a political worldview, that it's not just static, right? You just don't have that worldview, but it's political. And you want to get actively involved in making change according to your political ideology. And so feminists, they have a worldview, and then they will take that worldview and get actively involved, whether it's raising consciousness about an issue that they care about or electing officials that are going to adopt policies that are in alignment with their worldview. That feminism, like most ideologies, it has a movement, a political movement or an activist component to it. Now, as you're going to see as we look at these different definitions, that the meaning of feminism is not fixed, okay? But we're going to see that there are certain core principles that we find in all the definitions of feminism that we're going to take a look at. So let's look at a couple of, a variety of definitions of feminism. So let's start with looking at the definition of feminism that's in your textbook from the McBride-Perry textbook that you have. In the textbook, the authors define feminism pretty straightforwardly. They say that feminism is acknowledging that most social systems work to the political and economic advantages of men and the disadvantage of women, okay? And so there's a couple of unique things about this definition. One aspect of it is that there's a specific recognition that feminism is about men and women. And so in a way, it's sort of a more second wave, sort of traditional understanding of feminism. We're going to talk about the waves of feminism in a second, in that it sees these, it's has a binary, men and women, right? And that that being a feminist is basically acknowledging that systems are set up to favor men and disadvantage women, okay? And so, from a more of a 21st century perspective, not that this isn't the 21st century, but, that this binary and understanding gender as men, women, might, seem as if it perhaps is not the most complete understanding or definition of feminism. Another aspect of this definition is that it focuses on systems, okay? And so it says that feminism acknowledges that most social systems work to the political and economic advantage of men and disadvantage to women. And so it sees, that basically that there is sexism within our systems, right? That sexism is this discrimination against one gender, in this case, women, and that it's kind of that sexism is baked in to our systems. So that's one definition of feminism. Here's another definition of feminism that comes from the International Women's Development Agency. And you can see that this provides a little bit more of an expansive understanding of or definition of feminism. In this definition, it says feminism is about all genders having equal rights and opportunities. It's about respecting diverse women's experiences, identities, knowledge, and strengths, and striving to empower all women to realize their full rights. So on the one hand, it is a little bit more expansive in that it says feminism is about all genders having equal rights and opportunities. So right there, you can see that that is maybe a little bit more of a modern definition of feminism in that it sees sort of a spectrum of genders, okay? And that feminism is about providing equal opportunity for all genders, not just men and women. But it also is women-centered in saying that it identifies women's experiences, identities, and empowering all women. Okay, but it is also more modern in that it is, that it is recognizing that that there's not one woman's experience, but that it's diverse and that there are multiple identities, and that empowering all women to realize their full rights. So it's a little bit of a more expansive and inclusive definition of feminism. The last definition of feminism that we're going to take a look at comes from the author and activist Bell Hooks. And so that's her pseudonym, her author's pseudonym. Her born name is Gloria Jean Watkins. And you can see that you have a picture of her in her young days in the 1970s when she really came to preeminence in terms of being a feminist writer and thinker. And then that's on the bottom is a picture of her as she aged. And unfortunately, she recently died in December of 2021. And so you can see sort of change and how she changed over the course of her life. And she's best known for not just the scholarly and the academic and the activist work that she did, but she worked her whole life in making connections between race, gender, and class. And so, today we're going to talk about intersectionality in a moment. That is the recognizing that there are lots of different, sort of discriminations and oppressive structures that work on people. And so that, gender discrimination is different for white women. It's different for white cis women compared to white trans women, right? That it's different for, white and black women, right? It's different for lesbian and straight women, okay? And so, you're going to see that in her definition that she, indicates this beginning of this intersectionality of realizing the multiple sort of oppressions that can work on people. And I like this definition a lot. I mean, I like them all, and this is not an exhaustive list. It's just 3 to get you sort of thinking. Bell Hooks writes that feminism is a movement to end sexism and sexist oppression. In a moment, we're going to actually define that. So just mark it there, and then we're going to talk about the definition in a second. Its aim is not to benefit solely any specific group of women and particular race or class of women. It does not privilege women over men. It has the power to transform in a meaningful way all of our lives. And so in a way, this is, a very sort of optimistic understanding of that when we get rid of discrimination on the basis of sex and gender, that it really has the opportunity to benefit all people in society, not just women. It's not like women are benefited and men are harmed. But in the article you're going to read this week, you're going to see that sexism has a detrimental effect on men as well, in terms of that it has, sexism has kind of clearly defined gender roles, and when you deviate from them, there's social pushback for it. And also, that it indicates that that feminism isn't about one group of women, but it's about all group of women. It doesn't privilege one group over another, and so it has like a very strong egalitarian or equity piece in it as well. So we've looked at different definitions of feminism, and there are more that you will come across in your life and even in this class. But you'll see that all these different definitions do share some core principles. So what do they share? One thing they share is that feminism, these definitions, recognize the presence of sexism and that the importance of fighting against sexism. And so sexism is defined as discrimination based on sex and gender, okay? And it's oftentimes sexism is seen as discriminating against female or women gender. And that also that sexism is that behaviors, conditions, or attitudes that foster stereotypes of social roles based on sex and gender, okay? And so you could say that, that certain, conditions such as life within a family, right? You could say that sexism is where they're like what it means to be a mom, or what it means to be a dad, or what it means to be a good boyfriend or a good girlfriend, right? That, that sexism is exploring and kind of pushing against the stereotypes regarding gender roles within marriage or within family life. Also pushing against those stereotypes that you see in the workplace, right? Or in other institutions. And also just attitudes regarding stereotypes, right? That people hold regarding, what it means, like how do women, what the stereotype of how a real woman talks or dresses, or a real man talks or dresses, okay? And so you can see that through line in these different definitions. Obviously, an emphasis on equality of rights and equality of opportunities, and you're going to see that throughout the course of the semester as we really look at this long time and continuing struggle to get equality of opportunity when it comes to, all genders, all sex. And then understanding that sexism impacts men as well as women and impacts people differently due to other forms of oppression, intersectionality, right? And so you definitely see that in the last two definitions that we took a look at. But these are sort of the underlying principles that, sort of are the core definition of feminism. So while there are core principles that unite feminists, there's a lot of key differences within feminism. There are different strands of feminism within feminism, or branches of feminism. And we'll be learning about those through the course of the semester, and we'll begin that work today. And so the first sort of major branches of feminism that you're going to be learning about in the textbook, and we're going to talk about today, is social feminists versus egalitarian feminists. And these are feminists that were the first feminists in the United States at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. There are really big differences between these two types of feminism. Social feminists really view women as fundamentally different than men. Social feminists, and not to be confused with socialist feminists, here we're talking about social feminists. They viewed women as being more moral, gentler, fairer, and also needing of protection. And so the social feminists, as you're going to see at the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th, they argue that more women should be given the right to vote, that women should be given the right to vote and begin some entry into the political realm. Why? Because women are going to bring a certain sort of characteristic, a needed characteristic to our politics, right? That they're going to vote for more moral laws, that they are going to, bring about policies that protect women, because women are in need of that protection. But at the same time, there was the egalitarian feminists, which were not the polar opposite, but maybe. Egalitarian feminists says that, as the word egalitarian, equal indicates, the egalitarian feminists basically said there aren't differences between men and women, that those differences are mostly constructed, and that, like race, sex and gender are not defining characteristics. And so that what are defining characteristics are denying women opportunities to get educated, be in the workforce, vote. And that, once you open those opportunities, we're going to see that there aren't major differences between men and women. So this was sort of the first, sort of the, not arguments, but differences within feminism. In the 1960s and 70s, we see, more branching off of feminism, the radical feminists and the liberal feminists. And the radical feminists and the liberal feminists sort of find their roots in radical feminists, find their roots in social feminism to a certain a degree. Liberal feminists definitely find their roots in egalitarian feminism. Radical feminists focus on the differences between men and between women and men, and that radical feminists actually see that there are these essential differences that are immutable. Radical feminists recently have been getting some, sort of negative and maybe justified pushback from other feminists, because radical feminists can be sort of critical of trans women, right? That there's something fundamental about being born a woman, right? And that you can't become a woman. And that's been a really controversial position. And it's a reflection of this sort of essentializing quality. Also, radical feminists are much more likely to recognize patriarchy and the male domination as a continual presence in our lives. Liberal feminists find their rooting in egalitarian feminists. They focus on the similarities between men and women and not the differences. And they work to reform the system to open up opportunities and equal rights for both men and women, right? So again, we sort of see the roots coming from the 19th century and early 20th century. We're going to be talking about a lot of different public policies, and you're going to see that, like, public policies over the debate over pornography or the debate over prostitution, that radical feminists and liberal feminists take very different viewpoints on that. When it comes to pornography or when it comes to engaging in sex work, radical feminists are saying you're just playing into patriarchy, right? That, when you are a porn star, you might think you're free, but you're really in the chains of patriarchy. But liberal feminists are like, hey, if guys can engage in pornography, why can't women? And that it's up to women to decide how they want to live their lives, and that they shouldn't be constrained by this notion of that you're feeding into patriarchy. We'll get into that later as we move on. There's eco-feminists, socialist feminists, black feminists, etc. And so as you learn more about feminism, if you take an intro to gender studies, you dig in more deeply on these different branches. And we'll do some of that work this semester. We're going to spend the last few slides taking a look at the historic eras of feminism, that historians like to put things in eras, and that we definitely see changes within feminism throughout history. And so placing these changes within specific eras with specific dates helps us sort of understand how feminism has changed over time. And so the diversity of feminism is seen in the different waves or eras of feminism within the United States. The first wave of feminism is from the late 19th century, or really the mid-19th century, to the early part of the 20th century. Then the second wave is from the 1960s to the 70s. Third wave is from the 1990s into the 2010s. Fourth wave, maybe we're in that now. We might even be seeing the cusp of the fifth wave, okay? So let's take a look at each of these waves in more detail. So let's take a look at the first wave of feminism that is from the mid part of the 19th century to the early part of the 20th century. And so keep in mind that the 19th century is the 1800s, so the mid part in the 1850s until the early 20th century, until the 1920s with the passage of the 19th Amendment, the amendment that gives women the right to vote. And so, the goals of this area, this time period, there were multiple goals. One of the goals, as it says there, was to open up opportunities for women. And so this included focusing on women's suffrage, that is, getting the right to vote for women. Also challenging what's known as like the cult of domesticity, that the women's places in the home, and that, wanting to open up opportunities for women to have opportunities outside of the home in politics and in the workplace. The types of feminism were the egalitarian and social feminism. And some of the key players from this time period are at the top there. Let me put my magic pen on here. So on the top, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton here and Sojourner Truth. And these are early feminists from the mid part of the 19th century. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist. That means she's a person who fought against slavery in the United States. And she and her husband on their honeymoon went to London for the World Anti-Slavery Conference, and that women weren't allowed in to participate in the anti-slavery conference. And she was angry about that. And she met Lucretia Mott, and they, formed bonds over not just their commitment to ending slavery, but also their commitment to getting equal rights for women. And as you will read about in the textbook, and we'll talk about that in 1848, there was the first women's conference in the United States at Seneca Falls, and that the presentation of the Declaration of Sentiments was there, which is basically taking the Declaration of Independence and changing it to, say that that women have these rights as well. On the other side here is Sojourner Truth, about the same time period. Sojourner Truth was born into slavery, and she escaped with one of her children. And then she actually fought to get her other child back from the slave owner, and she won. And she was one of the first women to win that kind of battle in court, which is just amazing given the time period. She's also known for the speech that she gave. She was an abolitionist, a women's rights activist, and that the speech she gave basically saying that ain't I a woman too, right? That I'm Black, but I also demand these rights as well. Susan B. Anthony, one of the major suffragettes in the United States, and here are some suffragettes marching in New York City in 1912, demanding the right to vote. The next historical era in feminism is known as second wave feminism, which really is defined by the activities in the 1960s and 70s. The context is the social upheaval that took place in the 1960s and 70s, in particular the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And so the women's liberation movement and the gay rights liberation movement, that was a part of this second wave of feminism. And so for feminists, that their goals were, sexual liberation. And so this idea that, seeing women as equal to men, not just in terms of their capacity to vote and have jobs, but, also in terms of their own sexual autonomy. And that was, also linked with, if you're going to be sexually liberated, then you need to have reproductive freedoms so that you can have sex, not just for having babies, but you can have sex for enjoyment as well. That the push for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment that we'll be learning about in a couple of weeks, and also increased equality outside of the home. So the fighting for the Civil Rights Act, including sex in workplace discrimination, and then later on with Title IX, that making it so that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in educational facilities. Some key folks at this time period are Gloria Steinem. So Gloria Steinem, she was a second wave feminist activist. She started Ms. Magazine. Shirley Chisholm also it was a part of the second wave feminism. She was the first Black woman to be elected to Congress from a district in New York. And then there was lots of all the other sort of social movements at that time period. There was a lot of activism on the streets, and that's sort of the women's liberation activism. A photo from that. There was pushback from the second wave feminists, and that pushback came in part from the passage of Roe v. Wade and seeing abortion rights as really a bad thing for our country, but also the fight against amending our Constitution to add the Equal Rights Amendment. And I've got Phyllis Schlafly here because she is probably the best known activist, sort of the anti-ERA activist. One might call her a conservative feminist, but some might debate that. And so she actually was at the forefront of this pushback on feminism and sort of the negative reaction to feminism in the 1980s as well. So these are some of the clear players. And then liberal feminism, radical feminism, essential feminism. These are the feminisms that are associated with this time period. So that brings us to third wave feminism, which is about 1990s to the early 2010s. The context here is postmodernism. And so postmodernism is this a European philosophy that, kind of takes over the academia during the 1990s. And it places an emphasis on deconstructing categories, right? And one of the categories that third wave feminists felt needed to be deconstructed was the category of gender, right? And so sort of seeing gender as a construction that needs to be taken apart and sort of thought about more critically. In many ways, it was a pushback on the radical feminism of the second wave feminism, right? A challenge to the assumptions of radical feminism that there's a sort of an essentialism. Now, there were liberal feminists in second wave feminism, but there also was, radical feminism, that women are fundamentally different from men, sort of reifying or, these categories, these binaries of women, men. And third wave was a kind of a reaction to that. It wanted to, push back on that essentialism, but it also, thought that part of second wave feminism was seeing women as constantly in victim, always a subject of oppression, always the subject of some sort of discrimination. And third wave feminists were sort of sick and tired of seeing feminism is seeing women as victims. And so in part, third wave feminists began resisting the label of feminism because it's too closely tied to some of the ideologies of second wave feminism. And also, pushing back on the radical feminism of, that, don't shave your legs and, don't have sex with men, men are the enemy. And basically adopting a more sex positive movement, as is indicated on the bottom with the slut pride, no slut shaming, right? That you can do with your body what you want to do. And then on the top, it's sort of also, sort of criticizing second wave feminism for focusing too much on white women. And that third wave feminism is really about the development of intersectionality, the recognition that feminism isn't just for white women, but we need to recognize the impact that gender inequality has on women. We also have to understand the role that race and class and other forms of oppression play on women. And so that is a part and parcel, a big part of third wave feminism. So that brings us to the last wave of feminism. We're going to be talking about the fourth wave feminism and maybe even moving into a fifth wave of feminism. And so this fourth wave starts in the middle part of the 2010s. And it is the context that the fourth wave sort of develops out of is the revelations of the sexual assault and harassment that was taking place, in particular in 2017, with the revelation of the ongoing sexual harassment and assault of Harvey Weinstein, who is the head of a movie producer. And so, this, investigating journalism that took place in the New Yorker and the New York Times, these reports, basically opened up people and women in particular to talking about the kind of assault and harassment that they have experienced in the workplace. And it develops what's known as the hashtag #MeToo movement, which is basically a much more concerted effort to fight against rape culture, to fight against sexual assault and harassment in all of its forms. And it's in some ways a reaction to third wave feminism that's sort of like, women aren't victims, stop with the always seeing women as being subject to this discrimination. The fourth wave feminism is saying, look, this sexual discrimination, assault, harassment, it's still alive and well, and we need to take it more seriously, and we actually need to do concrete things to change the world that we live in. And so fourth wave feminism sort of uses social media, Twitter, and other platforms in order to raise awareness about the presence of this kind of harassment within our culture. And also fourth wave feminism is known for taking more seriously intersectionality. So intersectionality sort of starts in the third wave, sort of saying we've got to recognize that the second wave feminists didn't really recognize the impact that race and class plays in terms of an oppressive aspect of the experiences and the lives of women. And so fourth wave feminism is saying we need to take this more seriously, and that that there needs to be a more serious consideration of the intersection of class, race, ableness, gender identity, and gender oppression. So, that's where we sort of are today. In our discussion this week, we're going to be sort of talking about maybe moving towards a fifth wave, maybe a backlash to feminism altogether, and also sort of the proliferation of moving away from the understanding of gender towards a much more fluid and sort of a non-binary thinking about gender itself. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. That in the next lecture, lecture 2, we are going to be taking a look at defining key terms beyond feminism. In particular, we're going to define terms like sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. So thanks a lot for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.